I don't have a PowerPoint for you. I thought about it and then I thought, I just don't feel like putting points up. So if you don't mind, I would just like to start by thanking Chiaki for inviting me. I attended my first regional librarians meeting in 1990. I graduated from library school in 1989. I attended my first national Japanese librarians meeting in 1991 and almost every single CEAL conference since 1990. It is, however, the first time I have ever been asked to present at one for CJM. And I never really expected to be invited to CJM because this committee's focus, indeed its name, is the Committee on Japanese Materials. And my library, UMass Amherst, has a relatively small East Asian collection and an even smaller budget. In fact, my annual budget for acquisitions is less than what some of you spend in a day. While I myself have little experience in building collections, my interest in providing access means that I have tried to keep a close eye on other people's collections. Now, Chiaki asked us to think about what lessons we learned from the pandemic, how our work changed, and what might going forward look like for us. There is no question that the pandemic was a remarkable learning experience. It was difficult for all of us, without a doubt, but our experiences may well have differed according to the size of our collections and the kind of users we supported. The big collections, the have institutions, were able to turn on HathiTrust access to the full text of their collections temporarily by shutting down lending. Awkward and inconvenient compared to flipping through books, especially for big sets, but better than nothing, and provided some amazing results through careful searching. Archives, special collections, and stacks access was limited to people with institutional access cards. The have-not institutions, the places that offer graduate programs in Japanese studies but without large research collections, found themselves stuck. Their students couldn't borrow books, couldn't do field research, and couldn't visit the archives or stacks at other institutions. At UMass Amherst, we tried to explain to our users how they could use EduRoam authentication and go sit outside the big collections to do their research in the cold, but very few of them took us up on that offer. I also found out in the pandemic that UMass Amherst chose not to send the East Asian collection materials to HathiTrust. They only used the main library. So none of my books were affected by that, and they could be lent out. The downside is that my students who were in other parts of the country could no longer access UMass Amherst materials. But quite frankly, the pandemic for me was a time of quiet contemplation since my faculty and students were so overwhelmed by just staying healthy, they didn't have much time to do research. When they did ask for help or chatted with me by Zoom, I did what I usually do. I looked for loopholes and alternative access and called in favors from alums or friends. The rest of you, though, I assume, had a quite different experience and were fielding desperate emails from people trying to get around any of the institutional roadblocks in order to access the materials they needed. So, everyone had a hard time during the pandemic, right? Is there anything really to talk about? I actually think that the situation for area studies and particularly Japanese studies was worse because of the way our collections have been funded through cooperative collection development, designed specifically to minimize duplication and facilitate access. Our Japanese language collections started at a handful of universities. In the post-war period, we saw a significant growth, an interest in area studies, and a booming economy created all kinds of opportunities for collection development. It's important that we acknowledge the role of the Tanaka Ten. So if you've never heard of that, the Tanaka Ten are 10 major collections that received funding from Kakue Tanaka to build up Japanese studies in the United States. Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Princeton, Chicago, Michigan, University of Washington, Seattle, UC Berkeley, Stanford, and Hawaii. These libraries divided up the regions of Japan and claimed certain fields to attempt to provide comprehensive coverage in those areas and minimize duplication. In exchange, they were expected to make materials known and accessible to others, which they did by publishing bibliographies and print volumes of their card catalogs to facilitate interlibrary loan. The Japan-US Friendship Commission also started giving grants to libraries in 1975 and chose to support the same 10 libraries. But active lobbying by growing institutions like Ohio State University in Pittsburgh and later UCLA and UC San Diego really forced the issue and got access to Japan-US Friendship funding as well. But still, in 1988, there were only 14 libraries in the United States getting the bulk of this outside funding to build Japanese collections and provide service to others. The rest of us expected to borrow these materials through interlibrary loan. Japan Foundation also provided library support, but to small libraries, so the ones that were not part of the Tanaka Ten. 238 libraries between 1973 and 1990 got Japan Foundation library grants. That gives you a good indication of how Japanese studies spread across the country and how many Japanese studies faculty were being hired at small collections without research funds. Thank you. So for many, many years, we favored building collections, and the outside funding and support made sense that we would limit those materials. But there was still a great deal of unhappiness. And by 1990, there was a growing demand for so much more than collections. And this all came to head at the Hoover Conference, which in turn created the NCC. And so we expanded to provide equitable access to scholars at institutions without Japanese studies librarians and to teach them how to do searching, get ILL, and all of these things like Mitsu and Adam showed us today. The amount of work that librarian members of the NCC did over the years is astonishing. And it has been well served, but really it is the librarians at the major collections that have taken on the brunt of service because they are the ones that have the specialized knowledge that others are seeking. So my question really is this reasonable? Is it sustainable? The pandemic showed us what happens when universities and libraries put their own users first, right? The flick of a switch affected all of us, including the grant-funded materials that were specifically targeted as available for fee-free ILL. Much of the emphasis on access has been funding-driven, and we, the have-nots, grew complacent about being able to get use ILL to get whatever we needed. And it was a shock to our researchers when they were suddenly blocked access to materials that they had grown to depend on. Even pre-pandemic, many institutions had an e-preferred policy to deal with shelving access, speed of acquisitions, and lack of cataloging. Why not just buy ebooks for your own collections if you can? It makes sense to me. I buy ebooks when I need to for classes, even though I know it means that some isolated scholar is going to have a harder time to gain access to it. So while I have spent the last 32 years fighting for access to materials, both within North America and from Japan, I would argue that we actually spoiled researchers by doing so much for them and making material so accessible. Really, why should faculty who take tenure track positions at universities without Japanese specialist librarians expect to be able to access the same materials they did as when they were in the big schools? Shouldn't they instead expect to have to either travel to places or purchase access affiliation cards? What happens if you librarians decide you can't do all of this extra work for other people and you want to turn off all of the volunteer work you do? I wish I had answers for you. I don't. I am not personally worried about researchers' access to materials. They will always find a way to get them. What I worry about is you, the service providers. I worry about librarian burnout. I worry that expertise is stretched too thin and undervalued. I worry that we have lost ground in instruction and that there are too many students and faculty who no longer have a clear understanding of basic information literacy. I worry about many things, but what I am confident about is that we will weather this storm and we will come out stronger. We have had amazing Japanese librarians supporting researchers in North America for well over 100 years. We have always had excellent librarians. I expect we will always continue to have expert librarians. I know the rest of you will keep fighting for collections access and sharing your expertise. What will the next battle be? Could be ebooks. We might go in a direction, but that is for you, my friends, the current generation of Japanese studies librarians to tackle. I have great faith that you will find a way to respect the past, serve the present, and prepare for the future. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing how you create your own paths forward. Thank you.